Welcome to Getting Personal with Plant Medicine. I'm your host, Diana Krach, and today I am joined by Dr. Gabby Pavelko of Rootless. How are you doing today?
Hi, Diana. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'm doing great. Feeling very energized. There's a lot of energy in the air these days. So I'm hoping to soak it all up.
Awesome. I love that. That's a great way to encapsulate the vibe right now. As the kids say, right? I don't know. I don't think they're even saying that anymore. But anyway.
I have no idea what the kids are saying. I'm so out of the loop.
Same. My husband's like, is this what they're saying? No, I don't know. I have no idea. Anyway. So I've talked about Rootless before on this show, but to those who haven't heard me talk about them, they are seaweed bites, and I am so interested in this company because I think it's really cool that you're taking something that is so underrepresented and showing the power of what it can be. And while seaweed isn't technically a plant, it is called the weed of the ocean. And I mean, why not consider it a plant? Because it's so similar in so many ways and it has chlorophyll. I feel like that it checks off enough boxes for me.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because when people hear that seaweed's not a plant, I think one of the first things people think is like, is it an animal? And similar to like how mushrooms are fungi,
Right.
seaweed actually has like its own grouping called Protista, I guess. And it's funny because I think you and I were actually talking about this, where some fungi actually are plants, and also I guess sea lettuces are technically plants. But
Right. That's right. Sorry, I meant to say there is one particular kind that is considered. So, I mean, I say it qualifies then because we have one particular seagrass. And seaweed is an amazing plant. Amazing plant of the sea.
it is. So I like to say like I work in plant-based medicine or food as medicine because I kind of see them both as the same thing, even if technically mushrooms are not plants and seaweed are not plants. But the company is actually called Rootless because seaweed is the only plant that doesn't have roots. So we say it doesn't take anything from the earth. It only gives back. And because of that, I mean, like you really need like very little to grow it.
So it's like an air plant, but for the water, in the water.
Exactly. Exactly. You need sunlight. It's already in water. You don't need fertilizers or anything like that. So it's really amazing.
It is.
And regenerative.
And as we'll talk about a little bit more, it parallels a lot with cannabis and CBD and hemp. And that was the industry that you were in before. So can you talk about like how you made that journey from cannabis and CBD to seaweed?
Yeah,
From
definitely.
Weed to seaweed.
We call it the other weed,
Yeah.
the seaweed, weed from the sea. Yeah, so I got into the cannabis industry early days, like 2016, and it was, really, I think back when people were in it to really help patients. And, that is what the industry had been for a long time before, a lot of us decided to enter it. And I was really intrigued. I actually was working in dispensaries on behalf of brands and talking to a lot of patients, and people were coming in and asking me like, I have MS, do you have any recommendations? And I was like, I'm not a doctor,
Right.
And neither is the person who's about to help you behind the counter and also tell you that Blue Dream is their favorite strain, So I actually decided to get a doctorate at that stage because I wanted to actually help patients and see what that would be like. So I originally went into my doctorate thinking I was going to specialize in mental health and addiction. And what ended up happening was that a lot of the patients who I ended up treating and who ended up resonating the most with my treatments were actually women, and they all had hormone issues. And traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture is a root cause medicine. And what I was seeing is that a lot of the hormonal issues were actually the root cause for a lot of the like anxiety, depression, mental health, and even addiction. What's interesting is that, I personally myself had a lot of hormonal issues and did not even really classify it as that. But when I was very, very young, I actually got my period very young. I was like 10, 11 years old. And I had the worst cramps and debilitating, like I would pass out. I had to get picked up from school every time I was, on my monthly cycle. And so my mom actually took me to my Western doctor who put me on hormonal birth control at like a very young age, like 12, for the purpose of regulating my cycle. And I think, back in that generation, that was really common. And so many women, myself included, was on it for over 20 years.
Yeah, it was that or nothing, It was just that or deal with it. Unfortunately.
Totally. And it helped. It seemed to be helping. I think, what none of us realized at the time is like when you're taking synthetic forms of hormones, the progestins, all of that sort of stuff, you're not actually ovulating. So your body is not producing its own hormones. And when you come off of it, for a lot of women, it can take months, years even to kind of like re-regulate and go back. And it's interesting because I'm the type of doctor who wants to try things that I'm going to have my patients do. And so I decided to actually go through a cycle of like IVF, essentially. So freezing my eggs as the first stage. And I had this like epiphany of like, I'm coming off of my like hormonal birth control to pump myself full of more hormones. And like, that's what a lot of women do is the first time they ever come off of like any hormonal birth control is when they, are trying to get pregnant. And these days it's almost at 40 years old and on average. And so, working with a lot of patients who were having, fertility issues and all of that, I was just like, is this normal? Is this like, and I started doing a deep dive into research, and there wasn't a ton of research, to be honest. A lot of the most recent research in terms of like vulvodynia, like painful penetration, essentially, was all from 2022. And that's actually, I think, when the World Health Organization like recognized it as a medical, disorder. And some argue that it is actually mental, which is interesting. But, it's fascinating to have seen kind of and been doing a lot of clinical work during this time. And now, a lot of the younger generations are saying, no, thank you to a lot of the hormones and things like that. So we're entering a new era where like I'm treating a lot of women who are, going into puberty or trying to get pregnant or struggling with postpartum or especially going into perimenopause and menopause and are like, I have no idea where to start. And I don't, necessarily want to be taking anything. So it's very much a natural regulation of their cycles using acupuncture, herbs, and Chinese medicine.
I love that so much. Like everything that you were saying resonated so deeply because, first of all, it makes me so excited to hear an acupuncturist talk about the intersection of plant medicine and traditional Chinese medicine, because I think that there are so many crossovers, and a lot of the acupuncturists I meet in real life, I'm saying a lot, there's only a handful that I've met locally, but they seem to compartmentalize it somehow. It doesn't seem like it's part of their plan.
Well, it's a little known thing that both cannabis and seaweed have been in the Chinese medicine materia medica for centuries.
Wow.
And I think that is partly because of politics, obviously. And just, like so many things, a lot of history is not necessarily passed down to generation the way it was. But like hua ma ren is basically like hemp seeds, very effective for patients,
mm-hmm.
and prescribed in China as mm-hmm. well as, the Western world. And seaweed, is super interesting because I was really fascinated by the fact that its Thai in the Western medicine, I would say is related to thyroid, but also in Chinese medicine, it's used to like treat goiter and phlegm and dryness. And as as we age, what happens, we become dry, our hormone levels start shifting, and we a lot of times become hypothyroid, essentially. And so, what does that mean? It means, you're fatigued. You, even after getting 8 hours of sleep, you still feel tired. You definitely have some brain fog. It's kind of not as clear as it used to be, kind of mental clarity
Anemia.
issues.
I was just thinking about that because of the iron that the seaweed can help replace, right? Because I that's one of the issues I have. And I was just thinking about that. It really does help with the energy. I mean, I can tell, I can attest to that for sure. I don't feel any kind of crash or anything like that either. And it's not like a spike in energy. It's just consistent, which is really great. Are you looking for a better way to offer cashless payments and increase customer loyalty at your dispensary? Meet Spender. Spender not only provides reliable, secure cashless payments, but also highlights your deals to recent shoppers to ensure they keep coming back for more. Your customers will love paying for free with their phones and earning Spender-funded rewards. Plus, you'll enjoy the risk-free 90-day money-back guarantee with no long-term contracts. Spender seamlessly integrates with your existing dispensary tablets through our browser-based merchant platform. No new hardware to install. Spender is also non-exclusive, so you can offer it alongside other payment methods to give your customers more ways to pay and earn rewards. Join over 50 dispensaries already using Spender. Getting started is easy, and it takes just a few days, not months. No more fees, no more ATM lines, just rewards for buying their favorite products. Ready to join? Visit spender.com/business to learn more. That's spender.com/business. So you already spoke to it a little bit, but can you expand a little bit more on how hormonal changes can result by adding seaweed to your diet? And probably more so than just having, sushi or like one of those dried seaweed snacks. I mean, is there like a certain amount that you're supposed to have every day?
Yeah, so it's interesting because in countries, like Japan and Korea, Okinawa, people eat a lot more seaweed, up to 10% of their diet as seaweed. And we see a lot lower incidence. There's a lot of research actually coming from those countries where people have less breast cancer. They have less metabolic diseases. And that's super interesting. We, in the Western world, a lot of people think they like the taste of seaweed and they go to Costco and they buy those seaweed sheets. And I'm nothing against those seaweed sheets, but they're usually either baked or fried. They're pretty high in sodium. And I'm not saying sodium's a bad thing. But, I think that a lot of people just say, okay, I checked the box. But what you'll notice from a lot of those other products and just nutrition facts panels in general is you don't actually have to say how much iodine a product has. If you remember, iodine generally people got through their salt since the 1920s in this country, iodized salt. Now a lot of people aren't using that anymore. We're using Himalayan sea salt. We're using, Maldon, and you'll see on those that it says this is not a source of iodide, which is a necessary nutrient.
Wow.
So
that is so interesting. I mean, not to cut you off again, but I was just thinking because as I told you off the record, I'm kidding. It's not off the record. I told you we weren't recording, but I said it on my other podcast that I used to be very allergic to all forms of seaweed and shellfish and all of that. And that included seaweed. Even just touching it, I would be sent to the hospital. And my point being that I also had a sensitivity to the iodine when you get the contrast for CAT scans, right? Is it CAT scans that you get that for? Whatever scan it is. I would always get like itchy, really itchy, and have like just discomfort the whole day after getting that, injection, whatever you want to call it. But then if I ate like the seaweed chips or something like that, I'd be fine because I grew out of my allergy. I left that part out. I like grew out of it in my teens. And so, but I still had like a sensitivity to the contrast. And I still have a sensitivity to like if I eat a lot of seaweed, if it's like fresh seaweed, right? So I wonder
Yeah,
like if there's some kind of correlation there, but you're the doctor,
definitely.
so
Well, I mean, it's super interesting because this will start to kind of almost even introduce how seaweed and cannabis actually have a lot of similarities, I
yeah.
think, because what a lot of people don't realize is actually like how seaweed is grown or processed actually makes a really big difference, similar to cannabis. So seaweed can be wild harvested, meaning it's actually kind of growing naturally at low tide. You go out and you actually clip seaweed cuttings, but you leave some behind so that it can regenerate for the next
Wow.
growth.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's today how all of our seaweed in our products is collected from Maine and from Ireland. So it's Atlantic nori and it's organic, it's wild harvested. There are known that there are not heavy metals in that water because seaweed is a sponge. It soaks up carbon, which is also really great for the environment. But, I think that if you're not knowing where your seaweed source comes from, the biggest concern that people have is like the amount of heavy metals. So even though we're getting all of our seaweed from clean waters, we are still third party testing it, just like you have to do with cannabis for those heavy metals. And I think that's so important for people to understand is, again, in the Western world, we're not familiar with like how to like source our own seaweed, how to cook it, all that sort of stuff. And so what we were really trying to do is make it so that it's a no-brainer. It's like, where it's coming from. You basically know exactly what you're getting, and it's convenient, so you don't have to cook it or anything like that. But it can also be ocean cultivated, and actually an amazing shout out for environmentalists and people who care about the sustainability of our planet. If we farm, it was modeled out that if we farm only 1.8% of the world's oceans, we could actually feed everyone in the world 10% of their diet with seaweed. Which is not a lot of ocean, and we can lessen our reliance on the land. So I think that is hugely amazing. And the goal would be to do that by 2050, and it would have like huge impacts for the environment. So that's really exciting. You can also indoor tank cultivate seaweed, just similar to how you can indoor grow
That's
cannabis.
so cool.
Yeah.
Don't give me another project. I'm just joking.
Yeah.
Let me grow that.
You can. A lot of people. So another thing that's kind of interesting is that there are actually state by state laws about how and where you can grow seaweed.
Yeah. I was just going to ask you that because when you're saying all of these amazing environmental things that can happen, I'm like, just like hemp. So what's the catch? Like, when is it going to become illegal, or is it already illegal to grow in certain places? It was my thought when you were saying that. So
Yeah, it's interesting. In the US, most seaweed is actually grown in like Maine, Alaska. A lot of like the native populations in Canada grow it as well. And it's similar to cannabis actually, where it's a lot of women. It's been passed down generation to generation. These people survive off of seaweed in times of famine. It's really amazing, and it kind of reminds me about the origins of cannabis, like so interesting. But yeah, it is like there are states where it's much more limited by how much you can grow and all of that sort of stuff. Obviously, there's not, the legalities of like shipping it across state lines and all that sort of stuff. But it is, if you imagine, seaweed is very heavy. Like, so what most people do is they harvest it and then they dry it and then they process it. And you can sun dry it, but like for those seaweed sheets, like I said, mostly they're like baking or frying it, which is, whenever you cook something, it takes some of the nutrients away from it, potentially. So yeah, I mean, you process it and then it's very similar to cannabis in that way too, like it is usable in a lot of its different forms, but you would not want to ship a ton of like wet seaweed across the country or around the world because that would just be crazy.
Yeah, right. So can you talk about some other ways people can pair seaweed with other types of plant medicine?
Yeah. So, what you were saying about energy, I think is really interesting because we actually did a consumer trial where women, specifically 35 plus, kind of entering into this like perimenopause stage of their life, a lot of their complaints is around fatigue or, just like feeling so tired. Like I said, even when you get 8 hours of sleep. And, these spikes of energy you get from coffee and, even from working out and all that sort of stuff, like people talk about, or energy drinks or whatever, but it's like, we have lived busy lives and what we need is actually more like sustained energy. And so it's interesting because other than that, seaweed is like a really amazing detoxifier. So I think what's really interesting is, women will write in and we have a pretty robust like consumer customer service like experience where like, they can talk to me if they want to and actually ask a doctor questions and things like that. So we get a lot of questions where it's like, I ate some seaweed and all of a sudden I'm going to the bathroom a lot. And I'm like, well, there's not that much fiber necessarily like in these bites. The fiber is coming from also the dates and the almonds and the seeds and stuff like that. So then I'm like, what is the rest of your diet like? What else are you eating? And what we're finding is that, when people have that kind of reaction, they're probably not getting enough fiber. So it's a really interesting, almost like diagnostic tool of like, if someone says that to me, other people say, I am getting pretty gassy. And that one's really interesting because seaweed's polysaccharides that are in it, they actually can enliven your gut bacteria. And like, so that's a question for that person of like, have you been diagnosed with SIBO, a small intestine bacterial overgrowth? Because that would explain, kind of that, like you might not actually want to be eating seaweed because you might be increasing, gut bacteria when actually what you're trying to do is like kill your SIBO. So super interesting. Another one is acne. There's a lot of skincare experts who say don't eat iodine or don't eat seaweed when you have acne. And I think what I've seen, anecdotally, clinically, is that when people have acne, they'll start, taking seaweed or iodine, and then they'll notice that their acne is getting worse. But because it's a detoxifier, it's actually cleaning everything out of your system. And so what I think is really interesting is that if you stop, of course the acne is going to be worse, but if you keep going, it actually gets better. So like a lot of women talk about how their hormonal acne specifically actually clears up because that's not so, like deep in your skin as like teenage acne, for example, or, that other types of acne. But I think that what we're really kind of, again, talking to is the thyroid, and really to take it like even a step back, like the thyroid is the battery of your body. It regulates all your hormones. And, when you don't have stress in your life, your body is, working better, your thyroid is operating better. But who doesn't have stress? You actually don't ovulate when you're stressed. Your body will not produce progesterone when like you don't feel safe. So I always, it's interesting. A lot of patients that will come to see me will say, like I'm taking CBD or I'm taking cannabis and it really helps me sleep. It really helps my stress. I think that something that happens to women as they get older is they, as their hormones decline, they have trouble sleeping because maybe they're woken up by night sweats or hot flashes or just light sleeping, all of that sort of stuff. And so a lot of women, Miss Grass and New Frontier Data actually recently put out some stats about what women are using cannabis for. And a lot of it was like menopause symptoms. A lot of it was sleep related, anxiety, stress related. And I think that, totally makes sense to me for all of the mechanisms that I'm saying.
I would agree. So before we end, where can people find you and how can they support you?
Yeah, so we are at get.rootless for Rootless on Instagram and all social media. We are getrootless.com. I am at Gabby Pavelko is my Instagram and kind of my social media platform. And I think that, if anyone is interested in not only like taking the products, like we're actually starting a massive trial right now for people who have never tried Rootless to see how tracking their symptoms, like a baseline of symptoms and then taking them for 4 weeks in a much larger venue will do, can definitely reach out through our website or hello@getrootless.com, and we can definitely get you signed up for that. But also, we are currently running a crowdfunding campaign where we want women to actually invest for their first time. And part of women's health is actually wealth planning for the future. If you think about things that cause women stress, not a lot of women are saving for their retirement or are financially, independent. So for a minimum investment of $500, you can actually become and get shares in Rootless. And that website specifically is invest.getrootless.com.
Awesome. Well, I know that you're going to come back and talk about other things. So I appreciate you sharing so much knowledge with us today, and I learned a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always so fun to talk about my favorite things. So.
Thank you. This podcast has been a product of Your Highness Media. Each episode is written, produced, and edited by Your Highness Media. Thank you for listening.